Sarah Martinez walked through the college hallway with her head down, the weight of her backpack pulling at her shoulders. Her combat boots made soft thuds against the polished floor as she navigated between groups of chattering students. The sleeves of her black hoodie were pulled down to her wrists, hiding the intricate tattoos that covered her arms like a second skin. At 28, Sarah was older than most students in her art fundamentals class. While they were fresh out of high school, still figuring out who they wanted to be, she had already lived several lifetimes. The transition from military service to civilian life had been harder than any mission she had ever completed. The GI Bill had given her the opportunity to pursue the art degree she had always dreamed of, but fitting in with students who had never experienced real hardship proved to be its own kind of battle. The art building stood at the far end of campus, a modern structure with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in streams of natural light. Sarah had chosen this school specifically for its art program, hoping that creativity might help heal the wounds that medicine and therapy had barely touched. She had been attending classes for 3 weeks now, and, while she excelled in the technical aspects of drawing and painting, the social dynamics remained a minefield she struggled to navigate. As she approached the classroom, Sarah could hear the familiar sounds of students settling in for the morning session. Professor Williams always started class promptly at 9, and Sarah had made it a habit to arrive early to claim a seat in the back corner. From there, she could observe without being observed, a skill that had served her well during her years in special operations. The classroom was a typical art studio, with easels arranged in a semicircle facing a central platform where models would pose or still life arrangements would be displayed. The walls were covered with examples of student work from previous semesters, a colorful tapestry of varying skill levels and artistic styles. Large windows along one wall provided the northern light that artists prized, while track lighting supplemented the natural illumination. Sarah slipped into her usual seat and began unpacking her supplies. Her art kit was meticulously organized, each pencil, charcoal stick, and eraser in its designated place. Organization had been drilled into her during basic training, and old habits died hard. As she arranged her materials, she became aware of hushed voices nearby. "Look at her arms," whispered a girl named Madison, a petite blonde who always wore designer clothes and carried a purse that cost more than Sarah's monthly housing allowance. "Those tattoos are everywhere. I bet she's been in prison or something." Her companion, Jessica, a brunette with perfectly straight hair and manicured nails, leaned closer. "My dad says people with that many tattoos usually have issues with authority. She probably dropped out of high school and is just here because she has nowhere else to go." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes focused on her sketchbook. During her years of service, she had learned to compartmentalize emotions, to push down reactions that could compromise a mission. But, sitting in this bright, peaceful classroom, surrounded by students who had never faced real danger, the comments stung more than she cared to admit. A third voice joined the conversation. "Maybe she's in a gang," suggested Trevor, a lanky young man with horn-rimmed glasses who fancied himself an intellectual. "Those look like prison tattoos to me. We should probably stay away from her. Who knows what kind of violence she's capable of?" The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. These students, who prided themselves on being open-minded and artistic, were making the same snap judgments that she had fought against her entire life. They saw the tattoos, the boots, the way she held herself with military bearing, and they created a narrative that had nothing to do with who she really was. Each of Sarah's tattoos told a story, marked a moment of significance in her life. The eagle on her left shoulder represented her country and her service. The compass rose on her forearm symbolized her ability to find direction even in the darkest moments. The names wrapped around her right bicep honored fallen comrades who had made the ultimate sacrifice. The intricate mandala covering her back had been started during a particularly difficult deployment, each session in the tattoo parlor representing another step in her journey toward healing. But these students saw only the ink, not the meaning behind it. They saw a stereotype, a caricature of what they thought dangerous people looked like. Sarah had risked her life to protect the freedom that allowed them to make art, to express themselves, to attend college without fear. Yet here she was, being judged as a threat by the very people she had sworn to defend. Professor Williams entered the classroom carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a leather satchel worn smooth by years of use. He was a man in his 50s with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His approach to teaching was gentle but thorough, encouraging students to push beyond their comfort zones while providing the technical foundation they needed to grow as artists. "Good morning, everyone," he called out, setting his coffee on the desk at the front of the room. "Today we're going to work on figure drawing. I want you to focus on capturing not just the physical form, but the essence of your subject. Art is about seeing beyond the surface, understanding the story that each person carries." The professor's words resonated with Sarah in a way that made her chest tight with emotion. If only her classmates could apply that philosophy to their interactions with her. If only they could see beyond her appearance to the person underneath. As the professor continued his introduction to the day's lesson, Sarah noticed the whispers around her hadn't stopped. Madison was now showing something on her phone to Jessica, both of them glancing in Sarah's direction with expressions of concern and distaste. "My brother's a police officer," Madison was saying in a stage whisper that carried farther than she probably intended. "He says that kind of extensive tattooing is usually associated with criminal activity. The military doesn't allow that much ink, so she must have gotten them afterward. Probably during whatever trouble landed her here instead of a real job." Sarah's pencil snapped in her grip. The sound was sharp in the relative quiet of the classroom, and several students turned to look at her. She stared down at the broken graphite, fighting the urge to correct their assumptions. Part of her wanted to tell them exactly who she was, what she had done, where those tattoos had really come from. But another part, the part that had learned to keep operational security even in civilian life, warned her to stay quiet. Professor Williams had begun setting up the day's still life arrangement, a collection of objects that would challenge the students to work with different textures and lighting conditions. But Sarah found it difficult to focus on the lesson when she could feel the weight of judgmental stares and hear the continued whispers of speculation about her background. "I heard she rides a motorcycle," Trevor was telling his neighbor, a quiet girl named Amy who seemed uncomfortable with the gossip but too intimidated to speak up. "And she lives in that rough neighborhood off Campus Drive. Definitely not someone we want to get involved with." The assumptions kept building, each one further from the truth than the last. Yes, Sarah rode a motorcycle, but it was a practical choice for someone living on a veteran's budget, not a statement of rebellion. Yes, she lived in a modest neighborhood, but it was clean and safe, populated mostly by working families and other students who couldn't afford the luxury apartments closer to campus. As the morning progressed, Sarah tried to lose herself in her work. Drawing had always been her escape, a way to process emotions and experiences that were too complex for words. Her hands moved confidently across the paper, years of precise military training translating into steady, controlled strokes. While her classmates struggled with proportions and perspective, Sarah's sketches showed a level of skill and observation that came from years of having to notice and record details that could mean the difference between life and death. But even as she worked, she remained hyper-aware of the conversations around her. The gossip had spread to other students now, each retelling adding new embellishments to the story of who they thought she was. By the time the class took their mid-morning break, Sarah had been transformed in their minds from a simple art student into a dangerous criminal who had somehow infiltrated their safe academic environment. During the break, Sarah stepped outside for some fresh air. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn light that photographers and painters dreamed of. She leaned against the brick wall of the building and closed her eyes, trying to center herself the way her therapist had taught her. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4. Repeat until the tension in her shoulders began to release. "Excuse me." Sarah opened her eyes to find Amy standing nearby, looking nervous but determined. The girl was small and delicate, with curly red hair and freckles that made her look even younger than her 18 years. "I just wanted to say that I think what they're doing is wrong," Amy said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Making up stories about you, I mean. It's not fair." Sarah felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than you know." Amy shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly struggling with whether to say more. "I know it's not my business, but you seem really talented. Your drawings today were amazing. I could never make lines that confident." Practice, Sarah replied. Lots of practice. Were you an art student somewhere else before this? The question was innocent, born of genuine curiosity rather than malicious gossip. Sarah considered how to answer. The truth was complicated, full of details that she wasn't sure a sheltered 18-year-old could understand. I had some training, Sarah said finally. Different kind of training than this, though. Amy nodded as though this explained everything, though Sarah was sure it explained nothing at all. Well, I think you're really good. And, I think they're being jerks. Before Sarah could respond, Amy had hurried back into the building, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts once again. The brief interaction had lifted her spirits, proof that not all of her classmates were content to judge her based on appearances alone. When she returned to the classroom, Sarah noticed that the seating arrangement had shifted slightly. Madison, Jessica, and Trevor had moved their easels farther away from her corner, creating a buffer zone that spoke volumes about their discomfort. Other students seemed to be following their lead, leaving Sarah increasingly isolated in her chosen spot. Professor Williams seemed oblivious to the social dynamics playing out in his classroom, focused instead on helping individual students with their technique. When he reached Sarah's easel, he paused longer than usual, studying her work with obvious interest. This is excellent work, he said, loud enough for nearby students to hear. Your understanding of anatomy and proportion is quite advanced. Have you had formal training? Some, Sarah replied, aware that her classmates were listening to the exchange. Well, wherever you learned, they did a good job. This kind of precision usually takes years to develop. He pointed to a particular area of her drawing. See how you've captured not just the form but the weight of the subject? That's sophisticated observation. Sarah felt a flush of pride at the praise, but she noticed it had the opposite effect on some of her classmates. Madison's expression had shifted from mild disdain to something approaching resentment. It was one thing to dismiss the tattooed girl as a troublemaker, it was another to watch her receive recognition for superior skill. As the class continued, Sarah became increasingly aware that she was being watched. Not with the idle curiosity she had experienced in her first weeks, but with active suspicion and hostility. The whispers had taken on a harder edge, and she caught fragments that made her stomach clench with frustration. Probably learned to draw in juvie, someone muttered. Teacher's pet syndrome, came another voice. Acting all innocent to throw us off. I bet she's older than she's pretending to be. Probably has a record and is using a fake name. The assumptions had taken on a life of their own, growing more elaborate and more damaging with each retelling. Sarah found herself in the surreal position of being painted as a dangerous imposter while sitting quietly in an art class, doing nothing more threatening than sketching a bowl of fruit. By the time class ended, the atmosphere around Sarah had become so toxic that she could feel it like a physical weight. Students packed up their supplies while maintaining careful distance from her area, as though proximity might contaminate them somehow. The isolation was complete and deliberate, a social quarantine based entirely on prejudice and fear. As Sarah gathered her materials, she overheard Madison making plans with a group of friends. We should probably tell someone about her, Madison was saying. I mean, what if she's really dangerous? What if something happens and we could have prevented it? Tell them what, exactly? Jessica asked. That she has tattoos and keeps to herself? Tell them that she doesn't belong here, Madison replied firmly. Look at her. Look at how she acts. This is a place for serious art students, not people who are just hiding from whatever trouble they've gotten themselves into. Sarah's hands stilled in their methodical packing routine. The accusation hit deeper than she cared to admit because it echoed her own deepest fears about whether she belonged in this environment. She had chosen art school as a path toward healing and self-discovery, but she was beginning to wonder if the gap between her experience and that of traditional students was simply too wide to bridge. The classroom emptied around her as students headed off to their next classes or to lunch. Sarah remained at her easel, staring down at her drawing without really seeing it. The morning had started with such promise. She had been looking forward to losing herself in the creative process, to the meditation of line and shadow that helped quiet the noise in her head. Instead, she felt more isolated than ever. The very thing that made her different, the experiences that had shaped her into who she was, had become weapons in the hands of people who knew nothing about sacrifice or service or the price of protecting others' freedom to judge. Professor Williams approached as she continued to sit in the empty classroom. "Sarah, isn't it?" he asked gently. "Is everything all right? You seem troubled." Sarah looked up at him, this kind man who saw her work rather than her appearance, who praised her skill rather than condemning her differences. For a moment, she considered telling him everything. About the deployment that had changed her forever, about the friends who hadn't come home, about the nightmares and the therapy and the long road toward healing that had led her to his classroom. "I'm fine," she said instead, falling back on the automatic response that had carried her through countless difficult moments. "Just thinking about the assignment." He nodded, but his eyes remained concerned. "You know, in my experience, the students who bring the most to their art are often those who have lived the most. Life experience informs creativity in ways that can't be taught from textbooks." His words were clearly meant to be encouraging, but they also told Sarah that he had noticed something different about her, something that set her apart from her younger classmates. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her, whether he recognized the signs of someone who had seen too much too young. As she finally gathered her belongings and headed for the door, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. She had joined this class hoping to find a new way to express herself, to discover whether the artistic talents she had nurtured in secret during her military service could become something more. Instead, she had found herself cast as the villain in someone else's story, judged and condemned by people who had never risked anything more significant than a bad grade. The hallway outside the classroom was busy with students rushing between classes, their conversations filled with the typical concerns of college life. Tests and parties, relationships and career plans, complaints about professors and excitement about weekend plans. Sarah moved through this river of normalcy like a ghost, present but not truly part of the world around her. As she walked toward the parking lot where her motorcycle waited, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would return to class with her head held high. She would continue to pursue her art with the same dedication and precision that had made her an elite soldier. And if her classmates wanted to waste their time creating fictional narratives about her life, that was their choice. But she wouldn't make it easy for them. If they insisted on seeing her as different, as dangerous, as someone who didn't belong in their comfortable academic bubble, then perhaps it was time to show them exactly what they were really dealing with. Not the criminal they imagined, but something far more complicated and far more challenging to their assumptions. The truth about who Sarah Martinez really was would emerge eventually. When it did, the students who had spent their morning crafting elaborate theories about her dangerous past would discover that they had been right about one thing: she was indeed someone to be reckoned with. Just not in the way they thought. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that matched Sarah's mood as she rode her motorcycle through the campus gates. Sleep had been elusive the night before, filled with fragments of dreams that mixed memories of her classmates' whispers with echoes of situations where being underestimated had actually been an advantage. She had learned long ago that people's assumptions could be powerful tools, but, in this context, the weight of their judgment felt heavier than any gear she had carried in combat zones. Sarah parked her bike in the same spot she always used, a space at the far end of the lot that offered easy exit routes and a clear view of approaching threats. Old habits from years of security protocols died hard, even in the peaceful setting of a college campus. As she removed her helmet, she caught sight of herself in the bike's mirror. The tattoos on her neck were barely visible above the collar of her jacket, but she knew they were there, along with all the others that her classmates found so threatening. The art building looked different in the gray morning light, less welcoming than it had seemed during her first weeks of classes. Sarah had always found comfort in creative spaces, but now she wondered if she was fooling herself by thinking she could find acceptance here. The transition from military to civilian life had been full of unexpected challenges, but she had never anticipated that the hardest battles would be fought in a classroom filled with easels and paintbrushes. As she walked through the hallways, Sarah noticed that word of yesterday's gossip session had spread. Students who had never paid attention to her before now watched her pass with obvious curiosity and wariness. The whispers followed in her wake like ripples behind a boat, each retelling of the story adding new details to the mythology that was building around her presence on campus. "That's her," she heard someone say behind her. "The one with all the tattoos." "I heard she was in a motorcycle gang," came another voice. "Someone saw her talking to some really rough-looking guys in the parking lot." Sarah almost smiled at that one. The rough-looking guys had probably been fellow veterans from her support group, men and women who gathered twice a week to share coffee and conversation about the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. Like her, they carried invisible wounds alongside their visible ones, trying to build new identities in a world that often seemed foreign after years of military service. The classroom was already half full when Sarah arrived, and she noticed immediately that the seating arrangement had become even more segregated overnight. Her corner was now completely isolated, surrounded by empty easels that created a buffer zone between her and the rest of the class. Madison and her circle of friends had claimed seats directly opposite her position, where they could watch her while maintaining maximum distance. Professor Williams hadn't arrived yet, but his absence meant that the students felt free to continue their speculation about Sarah's background without fear of being overheard by authority figures. The conversation had evolved from whispers to open discussion, as though Sarah wasn't present to hear their theories about her life. "My roommate works in the admissions office," a girl named Brittany was saying to anyone who would listen. She said there was something weird about her application. Like, gaps in her education that don't make sense. And her address before this was some kind of government facility. Sarah kept her expression neutral as she set up her easel, but internally she was amazed at how efficiently the rumor mill could transform basic facts into sinister implications. Yes, there had been gaps in her formal education because she had been serving her country in places most of these students couldn't find on a map. And, yes, her previous address had been a government facility, because military bases were technically government facilities. But, in the hands of imaginative college students, these mundane details became evidence of criminal activity or mental instability. Trevor had appointed himself as the group's investigative journalist, and he was clearly enjoying his role as the expert on Sarah's supposed background. "I've been thinking about it all night," he announced with the self-importance of someone who had never actually thought about anything more serious than homework assignments. People don't just show up at art school with that level of technical skill unless they've been practicing somewhere specific. And the military doesn't teach figure drawing. So where do you think she learned?" Madison asked, leaning forward with obvious fascination. "Prison art programs," Trevor replied with confident authority. "They have classes in some of the higher security facilities. It's part of rehabilitation for violent offenders." That would explain the tattoos, the skill level, and why she's so much older than the rest of us. Sarah had to admire the creativity of the theory, even as it made her stomach churn with frustration. The idea that her artistic abilities, which she had developed through years of discipline and practice, were being attributed to incarceration was both insulting and absurd. But she also recognized the danger in letting these stories go unchallenged. In her experience, lies left uncorrected had a way of becoming accepted truth. Amy, the red-haired girl who had approached Sarah the day before, was sitting closer to the gossip circle than usual, and Sarah could see her discomfort with the direction of the conversation. Several times she opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, clearly struggling with whether to defend someone she barely knew against classmates she saw every day. "Maybe we should just ask her," Amy finally suggested in a small voice. "I mean, we're making up all these stories, but we don't actually know anything about her." The suggestion was met with a mixture of scorn and nervous laughter. "Ask her what?" Jessica responded. "Hey, are you a convicted felon? Have you killed anyone? Why are you really here?" "She's obviously not going to tell us the truth," Madison added with the certainty of someone who had never been in a position where the truth was complicated. People like that always have cover stories. They're good at manipulation. Sarah's hands tightened on her drawing pencil. The casual way they discussed her supposed criminality, as though her entire identity could be reduced to their fearful assumptions, brought back memories of other times when she had been underestimated or misunderstood. The difference was that in those situations, being underestimated had often worked to her advantage. Here, it was simply painful. Professor Williams finally arrived, looking harried and carrying what appeared to be several large portfolios under his arm. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," he called out as he set his materials down. "I was meeting with some visitors from the Regional Art Council. They're looking for student work to feature in an upcoming exhibition." The announcement immediately shifted the attention of the class away from their speculation about Sarah. An exhibition meant exposure, recognition, the possibility of being noticed by people who could influence their future careers. For art students, especially those still building their portfolios, such opportunities were precious. "The exhibition is focused on emerging voices in contemporary art," Professor Williams continued, pulling out a stack of flyers. "They're particularly interested in work that demonstrates technical excellence combined with unique perspective. Students from several colleges in the region will be represented." Sarah felt a flutter of interest despite her current social difficulties. She had been creating art throughout her military career, sketching during quiet moments between missions, painting in whatever temporary spaces she could claim as her own. Her work had been purely personal, a way to process experiences that were difficult to discuss even in therapy. The idea of sharing it with a broader audience was both exciting and terrifying. "I'll be reviewing portfolios over the next few weeks," the professor continued, "and selecting pieces that I think best represent the caliber of work being produced in this program. If you're interested in being considered, I encourage you to put together a selection of your strongest pieces." As he distributed the flyers, Sarah noticed the calculating looks that passed between some of her classmates. Madison's expression had taken on a competitive edge that transformed her earlier disgust into something more focused and, potentially more dangerous. "Professor Williams," Madison raised her hand with artificial sweetness, "when you're selecting work for the exhibition, do you take into account the artist's background? I mean, the integrity of the program and all that?" The professor paused in his distribution of flyers, clearly puzzled by the question. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Madison." "Well," Madison continued, glancing meaningfully toward Sarah's corner, "some people might have advantages in terms of experience that aren't exactly traditional. It might not be fair to other students who are learning everything for the first time." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized what Madison was attempting to do. Unable to simply ignore Sarah's superior skill, she was now trying to have her excluded from consideration for the exhibition on the grounds that her abilities were somehow illegitimate. Professor Williams followed Madison's glance toward Sarah, and his expression became thoughtful rather than confused. "Madison, are you suggesting that some students shouldn't be eligible for the exhibition because they have prior experience?" "I'm just saying that if someone learned to draw in prison art programs or gang workshops or whatever, it might give them an unfair advantage over students who are learning properly," Madison replied, her voice carrying clearly across the classroom. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward her, waiting for her reaction to the barely veiled accusation. For a moment, she was transported back to other moments of confrontation, times when the wrong response could have meant disaster for herself or her team. But this wasn't a combat zone, and these weren't enemy combatants. These were sheltered college students whose biggest challenges involved choosing majors and managing student loan debt. The realization helped Sarah find her center, drawing on reserves of patience that had been tested in far more serious circumstances. "I think," Professor Williams said slowly, his voice carrying a warning edge that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats, "that art is about vision and skill, regardless of where those qualities are developed. Some of our greatest artists have come from unconventional backgrounds." "But surely there are standards," Trevor jumped in, apparently emboldened by Madison's directness. "I mean, this is an academic institution. We can't just ignore questions about people's backgrounds when they might affect the integrity of the program." Sarah had heard enough. She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor in the sudden quiet of the classroom. Every conversation stopped, every student frozen in place as though her movement had triggered some kind of alarm. "You want to know about my background?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and clear, carrying the authority that had once commanded the attention of highly trained soldiers in life-or-death situations. "You want to know where I learned to draw, where I got my tattoos, why I'm older than you?" The students who had been so bold in their speculation now looked distinctly uncomfortable with the prospect of actually confronting the subject of their gossip. Madison's face had gone pale, while Trevor seemed to be reconsidering his position as the group's chief investigator. Sarah, Professor Williams began, clearly sensing the tension in the room. You don't have to, it's fine, Sarah interrupted gently, turning to smile at the professor before addressing her classmates again. You've all created very creative stories about me. Prison, gangs, criminal background, fake identity. Very imaginative. But, since you're all so curious, and since you seem to think my background disqualifies me from being here, let me tell you the truth. She moved closer to the center of the room, and several students instinctively leaned back in their chairs. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that people who spent their time studying human nature and emotion in art were so completely unable to read the person standing in front of them. I learned to draw during my 12 years in the United States military, Sarah said, watching as confusion replaced fear in the faces around her. I started sketching during my first deployment when I was 19 years old, in Afghanistan. Pen and paper were about the only art supplies that could survive combat conditions. The word deployment seemed to hit the room like a physical force. Several students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from hostility to bewilderment as they tried to reconcile their assumptions with this new information. My tattoos, Sarah continued, rolling up her sleeves to reveal the intricate artwork covering her arms, each one represents something significant from my service. This eagle is for my country. This compass rose represents navigation training that saved my life more than once. These names, she pointed to the script around her bicep, are for friends who didn't make it home. Madison's mouth had fallen open slightly, and Trevor looked as though he was struggling to process information that didn't fit his carefully constructed narrative. The room had become so quiet that Sarah could hear the rain pattering against the windows. As for my age, Sarah said with a slight smile that held no humor, I'm 28 because I spent 8 years in special operations before using my GI Bill benefits to pursue the art degree I always wanted. The government facility where I lived before this was Naval Base San Diego, where I completed my final assignment before transitioning to civilian life. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, broken only by the sound of rain and the distant noise of other classes conducting their normal activities. Sarah looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each student who had participated in the morning's character assassination. The gaps in my education exist because I was busy serving in places like Kabul and Kandahar, protecting the freedom that allows you to sit in this classroom and make art without fear. My technical skills come from years of documenting missions, sketching terrain features, and using whatever quiet moments I could find to develop my abilities. Amy was staring at Sarah with something approaching awe, while most of the other students looked as though they wished they could disappear entirely. Professor Williams was watching the scene with obvious fascination, his artist's eye clearly appreciating the dramatic revelation unfolding in his classroom. So yes, Sarah concluded, rolling her sleeves back down and returning to her easel, I do have an unconventional background. I've seen things and done things that most people can't imagine. But I earned my place in this classroom the same way you did, through talent and hard work and the desire to learn something new. She sat back down and picked up her pencil, signaling that her speech was over. The effect on the classroom was immediate and profound. Students who had been whispering and plotting moments earlier now sat in stunned silence, struggling to process the complete reversal of their assumptions. Madison looked as though she might be sick, while Trevor had gone an interesting shade of red that suggested he was experiencing the full weight of his earlier statements. The girl named Brittany, who had claimed inside information about Sarah's application, was studiously avoiding eye contact with everyone. Professor Williams cleared his throat, clearly searching for a way to move the class forward after such a dramatic revelation. Well, he said finally, I think this illustrates perfectly why we study art in the first place. To see beyond surfaces, to understand the stories that shape human experience. He moved to the front of the classroom and began setting up the day's still life arrangement with deliberate normalcy. Today we're going to work on capturing light and shadow, he announced, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had made him popular with students. I want you to think about how light reveals truth, how shadows can hide or distort our perceptions. The metaphor was not subtle, and Sarah caught the professor's brief glance in her direction. She nodded slightly, appreciating his attempt to weave the morning's events into a broader lesson about perception and judgment. As the class began to work, the atmosphere remained tense and awkward. Students who had been confidently vocal earlier now seemed afraid to make eye contact with Sarah, let alone continue their speculation about her background. The revelation that she was a military veteran rather than a criminal had shattered their comfortable narrative and left them uncertain how to respond. Sarah found herself oddly relieved by the turn of events. She had been carrying the weight of her classmates' assumptions for weeks, watching them construct elaborate theories about her dangerous nature without having any way to correct their misconceptions. The truth, she reflected, was often more powerful than any fiction. But she also recognized that her revelation had created new complications. Some students might now view her through the lens of different stereotypes about veterans, assumptions about PTSD or violence that were just as unfair as their earlier theories about criminal activity. The challenge of being seen as an individual rather than a representative of a group remained unchanged. As she worked on her drawing, Sarah became aware that Amy had moved her easel slightly closer. The gesture was small but significant, a quiet statement of solidarity from the only student who had shown her kindness. When their eyes met, Amy offered a shy smile that Sarah returned with genuine warmth. The morning progressed with unusual quiet as students focused intently on their work, perhaps using the concentration required for art as a way to avoid dealing with the social awkwardness they had created. Sarah lost herself in the familiar rhythm of observation and mark-making, letting the meditative aspects of drawing help ease the tension in her shoulders. When Professor Williams stopped by her easel to review her progress, he lingered longer than usual, studying not just her current work but the sketches visible in her open portfolio. "These are remarkable," he said quietly, indicating a series of drawings that captured moments from her military service with startling intimacy and emotional depth. "Have you considered documentary art as a focus? Your perspective on these experiences is unique and powerful." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at the recognition. "I've never thought about showing them publicly," she admitted. "They're pretty personal." "The best art usually is," Professor Williams replied. "But sometimes sharing personal truth can help others understand experiences they've never had. Your work could build bridges." As the class period neared its end, Sarah noticed that the social dynamics around her were beginning to shift in subtle ways. The hostile whispers had been replaced by curious glances and what appeared to be genuine interest rather than fear. Some students seemed to be reconsidering their earlier judgments, while others appeared to be struggling with the cognitive dissonance between their assumptions and reality. Madison and her immediate circle remained pointedly focused on their work, avoiding any acknowledgement of the morning's revelations. But Trevor, perhaps realizing how badly he had embarrassed himself with his confident theories about prison art programs, kept glancing in Sarah's direction with what looked like growing respect rather than suspicion. When class finally ended, the usual rush toward the door was replaced by a more subdued exit as students seemed uncertain about how to navigate the new social